My name's Ethan Carr. When they gave me the junior title, I didn't argue. Didn't send a follow-up email. Didn't ask for clarification. Just nodded, said, "Understood," and closed the door behind me. That was 3 years ago. At the time, we'd just closed a Series B round and were restructuring for scale. New leadership had arrived. New terms were being used in meetings: headcount leverage, growth efficiency, role consolidation. My actual title was supposed to be Director of Client Success. That's what my original offer said. That's what the recruiter called me. That's how the clients referred to me, because that's what I was doing. But someone in finance flagged the comp. Too high for the new band. Would set a precedent. The COO came to me smiling like he was handing me a favor. "We're shifting to a flatter model. Fewer titles, more impact. We want the work to speak louder than the role." I knew what that meant. It meant I was expensive and too quiet to be a threat. So they gave me Client Success Associate. No budget authority, no direct reports, no invitation to leadership sinks. But I kept my accounts, the biggest ones. And I didn't correct a single client when they introduced me as the director, not out of spite. Just clarity. Because it didn't matter what they called me internally. The people who paid us thought I ran the show. My calendar stayed full. Clients didn't care about job titles. They cared about answers. They cared about seeing a face when things broke, about feeling heard when contracts changed, when support ghosted them, when product promised and didn't deliver. And I listened. Every frustration, every delay, every subtle "we might be exploring other options," I took notes. And slowly, I began to see something the leadership team hadn't. We weren't losing deals because of product. We were losing them because no one knew how to hold the line after the sale. They thought success was about satisfaction scores. I knew it was about relationship infrastructure. Not touch points, not check-ins. Infrastructure. The quiet scaffolding that keeps someone from leaving, even when the software isn't perfect. So I started building it. In spreadsheets, in templates, in Slack messages at 11:43 p.m. that no one saw but kept an account from churning. They didn't notice, but the clients did. And one by one, they stopped asking for new points of contact. They started asking for me. My official responsibilities fit neatly inside a 3-line job description. What I actually did, it took up 90% of what held our client base together. I was listed as an associate, but I was the one reworking onboarding flows after clients got confused by our auto-generated welcome emails. I was the one rewriting our NPS follow-ups so they didn't sound like they'd been written by a machine. I was the one explaining to product why 5 clients were all asking for the same undocumented feature workaround and how their frustration wasn't about the feature. It was about being ignored. And I did all of it, quietly. While the senior managers were hosting coffee chats and reshuffling slide decks, I was on Zoom with operations leads walking them through exactly how to get around our own flawed data sync. One day a client in Texas said it flat out. "I don't know what your title is, Ethan, but I tell my team you're the one we trust." That one stuck with me. So I wrote it down, in a document I kept for myself. A kind of living record. I didn't need recognition, but I needed a map, a reminder of how trust actually formed, how it scaled. Because I knew one day they'd ask how we kept certain clients from walking, and no one at the top would know the answer. Internally, things were shifting. Leadership was pushing a new playbook: quarterly business reviews, client segmentation models, mass email cadences. All formula, no connection. They called it scalable success. But I watched as the numbers quietly softened. Response rates dropped. Renewal signals got weaker. Clients started escalating things that could have been solved with a 3-minute Slack. They asked the directors what was happening. The directors asked the platform. The platform said, "All metrics within tolerance." So nothing changed. Meanwhile, I kept doing what I'd always done. A new client in retail nearly churned over a missing invoice report. I pulled the last 6 months manually, color-coded the issue, and included a screencast showing how to avoid it in the future. They renewed for another year. No one above me saw it, but the client's VP sent a message. "You're the only one who acts like you're inside our business." That's when I realized they didn't need a support rep. They needed a partner, someone who understood that churn isn't a moment, it's a slow leak, and I was the only one plugging it. I still had no title, but the clients kept calling me when things mattered. And when the layoffs started later that year, none of my accounts were flagged as at risk. They didn't understand why, but I did, because while they scaled headcount and modeled churn curves, I was building the thing they thought they already had. At some point, the gaps became routine. The onboarding team would promise features that weren't ready. Support would mark a ticket resolved, even when the issue just got renamed. The QBR team would show up with the same slide deck they used on a biotech client and try to use it on a logistics firm. And when the client got frustrated, the answer was always, "Loop in Ethan." No one said it out loud, but the rhythm became clear. If the deal was in trouble, I was called in. If the client was quiet too long, I was looped. If someone needed to talk a client out of leaving, I was scheduled. But still, I was just an associate. They didn't promote me. They just used me, and I let them. Because I wasn't building a resume. I was building something else entirely. A survival model, not for me, for the clients. And eventually, for what came next. By year 2, I'd rebuilt most of the client lifecycle under the radar. I kept my own records. Which responses triggered engagement? Which templates annoyed senior clients? Which platform bugs could be predicted by behavior before they were reported? None of this was in our CRM. It lived in my notes, in air-gapped docs, in after-hours calls with client admins who didn't even trust our platform anymore, but still trusted me. The leadership team started to notice. Not me, the numbers. Client satisfaction in my segment rose 27%. Churn was 0. Referrals ticked up, NPS climbed. So they did the most predictable thing possible. They launched a task force, Project Lighthouse, replicating high retention models across CS. They asked me to share what's working. I smiled. Created a doc, gave them just enough. They ran workshops, made a new slide deck, sent a company-wide memo celebrating our new model for sustainable client success. I wasn't mentioned. I didn't care, because I knew something they didn't. You can't replicate a system you don't understand. They saw the results, but not the structure. They saw the effect, but not the labor. And while they clapped for themselves in company meetings, I kept building. My systems ran through Google Sheets, not Notion, not Salesforce, because those tools were visible. And I'd learned a long time ago, anything visible becomes political. So I built invisible things, like renewal warning indicators based on language drift in emails, like heat maps of accounts where the CFO stopped attending syncs. They called my approach old school, but my account stayed. Then one afternoon, I got a call from a client I hadn't heard from in weeks. She didn't want to talk about product. She wanted to tell me she'd just been pitched by a competitor. It was slick, she said. But they didn't ask about our problems. You did. I asked if they were considering switching. She paused. If you ever leave, we might. That's when I understood exactly what I'd built. Not customer success, not retention, not satisfaction. Trust. And not with the company, with me. And trust? That's the only thing you can't fake in a churn report. By the beginning of year 3, things had changed, but only on the surface. The company had doubled headcount. Marketing had rolled out a glossy rebrand. A new VP of customer experience was hired from a Big 4 consultancy. There was a new mission statement, a new voice. Internally, it was the same machine, just shinier. And under the surface? Cracks, but not loud ones. Hairline, structural. The kind that only widen if you know where to listen. I was given a promotion that year, not a real one. The email said I was now a senior associate client retention strategy. No change in authority. No new reports. No budget. Just an extra line on the org chart and a slightly bigger audience for my meeting recaps. People congratulated me. I nodded and said thank you. But in my notes I wrote, still invisible, still essential. That was the paradox I lived in. Because while the titles changed and the reorg stacked up, my process still held. No churn in my segment. Highest renewal rate. Fastest escalation resolution. Lowest cost per retained account. And none of it came from the new Client Intelligence Suite they rolled out with a fanfare and a ribbon-cutting Zoom. It came from remembering when a CFO's daughter had surgery, flagging a renewal risk because a client's tone went from "let's hop on a call" to "just send the link," pre-writing status updates before they were requested, checking in during silence, not after complaints. But when the board asked the execs what was working, they pointed to automation tools, NPS dashboards, segment analysis. Not one of them could explain why a Fortune 100 client had renewed for 3 years instead of 1. I could, but they didn't ask, so I didn't offer. That spring, the layoffs began, quietly. At first, it was product contractors, then mid-tier account managers, then one of the directors who used to circle back whenever I flagged something urgent. The company line was strategic consolidation, but I knew the truth. The expansion had outpaced retention, and the churn that started as a slow drip was now a quiet flood. But not in my segment. Mine was still solid. So when they had to consolidate client portfolios, guess whose systems they cloned? Mine. Except they didn't know how to use them. One senior manager got assigned 3 of my old accounts. He called me in a panic 3 weeks later. "Do you have a template or something I can use? I don't understand their renewal logic." I sent him a sanitized version of my framework. He tried to follow it, but missed the part where the relationship was the framework. He didn't renew one of those accounts. Blamed pricing, blamed product, but I knew what it was. No one ever taught him to see friction before it had a name. I started thinking about leaving that summer. Not out of anger, out of readiness. I'd built something that worked, not loudly, not visibly, but deeply. And I realized something important. You don't need power to have leverage. You just need irreplaceability. And in a system built on dashboards and ego, quiet irreplaceability is the one thing no one knows how to protect until it's gone. So I gave them no warning. I left no manifesto. I just saved every template, every note, every pattern. And on my last day, I walked out like I always had, without a title worth printing, but holding everything that actually worked. I didn't announce I was leaving. No farewell thread, no Slack message, no Zoom send-off with cupcakes and digital gift cards. I just handed in my notice, documented what I was required to, and walked out with my folders zipped, my templates cleaned, and a quiet goodbye to the few people who knew what I really did. It took them exactly 3 weeks to realize something was wrong. The cracks didn't appear in meetings. They showed up in inboxes. Clients who had always been easy were suddenly slow, less responsive, more transactional. One client that used to reply within an hour now took 4 days. And when they did, the tone was clipped. Another escalated what used to be a casual friction point straight to the CEO's office. But no one made the connection. They blamed the market, the quarter, post-layoff disruption, until the numbers came in. That quarter, the company lost 5 legacy accounts, 3 of which had been mine. Another 6 shifted into retention risk territory. The board called it noise, but the numbers didn't lie. $4.7 million in annualized revenue, gone. Not to product issues, not to price, to absence. Because the new system didn't know how to recognize slow drift, and no one had inherited the intuition I'd built. I heard about it first through a friend still inside. She messaged me. "They're scrambling, pulling reports, making dashboards to explain the churn. Everyone's acting like it's sudden, but it's not, is it?" I didn't answer right away. Then I replied, "No, it started a year ago. They just stopped listening before it had a name." By month 4, the firm was in crisis mode. They brought in a management consultant to evaluate client lifecycle gaps. I knew what that meant. They were looking for someone to blame. But they didn't need blame. They needed repair. And repair was expensive when the system was designed to look impressive, not actually function. That fall, one of the board observers made a recommendation. Bring in outside help, not for PR, not for product, for retention. An external firm, boutique, quiet, with a record of rebuilding broken client trust structures. That firm was mine. I'd found it 6 months after I left. Small team, high judgment. No dashboards, just performance. We didn't advertise, didn't pitch. We got referrals from people who knew what real risk looked like when you stopped pretending everything was fine. When the paperwork came through, my name wasn't on the first page. I didn't need it to be, because when I walked into that boardroom for the first scoping meeting and they saw me, The silence said more than any speech could. The same people who once told me I was not quite senior enough now stood when I entered the room. The VP of Customer Experience looked like he'd seen a ghost. The CEO said cautiously, "Ethan, didn't expect you." I nodded once, calm. "I'm here to help." And I was, but not for them. For the clients. For the structure I'd once built, and now had the chance to rebuild again. This time, on my terms. We signed the contract under a neutral name, Andon Strategy Partners. No fanfare, no press release. Just a one-year engagement scoped for retention stabilization and executive advisory. Inside the firm, only a few knew what that really meant. To the board, I was now external oversight. To leadership, I was a quiet consultant. To the clients, I was still Ethan, the only person who'd ever listened before the damage started. But this time, I wasn't here to patch things. I was here to redesign the system they thought they'd already built. The first thing I asked for wasn't metrics. It wasn't permission. It was access, not to dashboards, to conversations. I needed transcripts, call notes, escalation trails, feedback logs that hadn't been tagged, emails that looked neutral but carried the weight of disappointment if you knew what to look for. I wasn't building a churn map. I was building a pattern of silence, because that's how it always starts. Clients don't complain. They just go quiet, stop replying, stop asking, stop needing you, until one day they're gone and everyone pretends to be shocked. Within 2 weeks, I'd flagged 14 at-risk accounts that weren't even on their radar. One had a new procurement head who'd stopped showing up to syncs. Another had moved their billing email to a generic address. A tiny move, but a signal. They're decoupling you. Another had started copying legal on emails. All of it could have been addressed months ago, but no one had seen it, because no one was looking at the relationship architecture. The VP of CX tried to reassert control early on. He asked to review and approve all outbound client touchpoints. I said no, calmly. Not because I was being difficult, but because I no longer answered to him. I answered to the board. And they didn't care about org charts. They cared about recovery. Every week I sent them a quiet brief, titled, Stabilization Signals. Active observations, no action needed, yet. I didn't call anyone out. Didn't name names. Just patterns. Client reply cadence softening by 28%. NPS volatility rising despite higher resolution rates. CSAT scores unchanged, but comments showing tone shift. More formal, less casual. All soft signs. But when read together, a map of slow departure. The board started asking the CEO why these things weren't already being tracked. He didn't have an answer. A month later, I rolled out a new framework. Not a tool, not a platform, a language. I taught the account teams to look for tone friction. I taught them to interpret silence as signal. I rebuilt the onboarding sequence, not for speed, but for trust calibration. And slowly, the metrics shifted. Clients began responding again. Escalations dropped. Churn projections stabilized. The CEO gave a company-wide update. We're seeing real traction. A new model is emerging. We've learned that client trust isn't just a number. It's a system. He never mentioned where that system came from. But I didn't need the credit, because this time the system had my name on it. Not in the press, but in the contract, in the structure, in the silence between leadership calls where someone finally said, "Let's run this by Ethan first." That's all I needed. They could keep their titles. I had something better now. Judgment, embedded, permanent, unquestioned. 6 months in, the engagement officially ended. The contract closed on a Friday afternoon, with a polite message from legal and a quiet thank you from the board's strategic oversight team. There were no balloons, no announcement, no public summary of what had actually happened. But internally, everything had changed. The churn stopped. Not because of a breakthrough, because the bleeding had been seen early enough, and someone finally built the process that no longer depended on luck, excuses, or hero moments. That process was mine, and I left it behind like a blueprint, not a performance. The CEO sent me one last message. We're going to keep implementing the framework you outlined. It's already embedded in how we approach things. Appreciate the clarity you brought, even if it was uncomfortable at times. I didn't reply, not because I was bitter, because there was nothing else to say. The clarity wasn't a favor. It was the cost of survival. A few weeks later, a client I hadn't spoken to in months reached out. One of the ones I'd worked with back when I had no title, no authority, just instinct and judgment. She said, "You're not at the company anymore, are you?" I confirmed. She paused. That explains the difference. Still stable, but quieter now, like someone took the weight out of the room. I asked if that was good or bad. "Neither," she said. "Just different. You had a way of making problems feel like they were being solved before we finished describing them." I thanked her, but I didn't explain, because that's what judgment is, solving what people don't know how to describe, and doing it before they realize it matters. The new advisory work came quickly after that. Word spread, not through press, but through whispers. "Call Ethan. He doesn't advertise, but he fixes things you can't even see breaking yet." I built quietly, chose clients carefully, never scaled past what I could control, hired people who listened more than they talked. And always I told the new team the same thing. Don't chase credit, build gravity. Let the right people orbit you. A year later, I was in another boardroom. Different firm, similar story. Big churn, big panic, big confusion. They asked if I had a proven model. I said I didn't have a model. I had a method. One based on attention, on friction mapping, on building client loyalty so deeply rooted in trust, even your competitors won't understand why you're hard to leave. They asked how I'd learned it. I didn't tell them it was from being ignored, from being undertitled, from carrying weight no one acknowledged until it was gone. I just said, sometimes the system isn't broken. It's just blind. My job is to help it see. They nodded like they understood, but most wouldn't, not really, because you don't see people like me. Not until you feel the silence after we leave.